Imagine the lights go out, not slowly, instantly. The concussion hits the hull before the sound does, a hammer blow that travels through steel and water, and into the bones of every man inside. Lockers tear from their brackets, glass shatters, the depth gauge spins. Another charge, closer. The submarine rolls, groans, holds, and then it waits. 60 men pressed into a steel cylinder smaller than a city bus, in absolute darkness, breathing air that is already running out, suspended 200 feet below the surface of an ocean that does not care whether any of them survive. This was not a rare nightmare. For submariners in the Second World War, this was the job. The submarine was the most lethal posting in any navy of the war. Not the most dangerous in isolated moments, not the most exposed, not the most visible, but statistically, as consistently, with grim precision, the submarine service killed more of its own men than any other branch of the military on either side of the conflict. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the German U-boat fleet, somewhere between 28,000 and 30,000 did not come home. That is a mortality rate above 70%. The United States submarine force, fighting a very different war across the Pacific, lost approximately 3,500 men and 52 submarines, roughly 1 in 5 of every American who pulled on a submarine uniform. In a war defined by mass death, these numbers stand apart. To understand why, we need to understand what a submarine was. Not as a symbol of technical ingenuity, not as the romantic weapon of the underdog, but as a physical space, as a machine designed, almost incidentally, for human survival. A standard German Type 7 U-boat was 220 feet long and 20 feet wide at its broadest point. Inside that hull lived a crew of between 44 and 52 men, sometimes more. There were no private quarters. Officers had curtained bunks in a passageway barely wide enough to turn around in. Enlisted men slept in shifts, a system called hot bunking, where a man climbed into a bunk still warm from the body of the man he had just replaced. There were 2 toilets for the entire crew, and using one while submerged required a 7-step pressurization process that, executed incorrectly, resulted in its contents being discharged back onto the user at considerable force. This was not a design flaw anyone rushed to correct. The temperature inside a submarine varied by theater of war and circumstance, but in the North Atlantic, that the hull was perpetually cold and damp. In the Pacific and Mediterranean, it became something close to unbearable. When a fleet submarine was running on the surface in tropical waters, internal temperatures could reach well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity climbed toward saturation. Clothes would not dry. Fungal infections became constant. Men's skin softened and broke down. Food rotted in its storage. The bread would develop mold within days of leaving port, and the crews ate it anyway, cutting away what they could see and ignoring what they could not. The air was always the most fundamental problem. A submarine submerged is a sealed container. Every man breathing inside consumes oxygen and expels carbon dioxide. A crew of 50 men submerged for any extended period began measurably depleting their own air supply within hours. Carbon dioxide, accumulating silently and without color, produced headaches first, then confusion, then a slow and dangerous deterioration of judgment. Submarines carried soda lime canisters, chemical scrubbers to absorb CO2, and pressurized oxygen tanks to replenish what was breathed away. But these were not unlimited resources. In a prolonged hunt, with depth charges above and the submarine unable to surface, the air became a clock counting down. The hunt itself had a specific anatomy. A submarine's power while submerged came from electric batteries, massive banks of lead-acid cells that provided quiet, reliable propulsion but carried a finite charge. At moderate submerged speed, those batteries might last 18 hours. At full submerged speed, trying to evade, they could be exhausted in less than 2. A submarine running from depth charges was spending its survival margin with every turn of the propeller. And so, the calculus of evasion was brutally simple. Move as little as possible, breathe as little as possible, and wait for the enemy to give up or run out of charges. The depth charge itself was an uncomplicated weapon, a canister of high explosive, set to detonate at a specific depth, dropped from a surface warship directly overhead. A near miss did not have to be close to be catastrophic. The pressure wave from a detonation traveled through water, an incompressible medium, and arrived at the submarine's hull as a pure, devastating shock. Light bulbs shattered, pipe joints cracked, gauges broke from their mounts, men were thrown off their feet. The pressure hull, the inner steel tube that kept the ocean out, flexed. Every flex was a test. Every test had a limit. British and American escort vessels in the Atlantic carried between 50 and 150 depth charges. Some attacks lasted hours, some lasted more than a day. There are accounts of U-boat crews enduring attacks of 16, 20, even 30 hours without surfacing, lying motionless on the seafloor in shallow water, speaking only in whispers, moving only when absolutely necessary. The crew organized into shifts where half the men lay as still as they could to conserve oxygen, while the other half watched the gauges and prayed that the sounds above them would eventually fade. They often did not. By 1943, Allied anti-submarine technology had improved dramatically. Yes, the introduction of centimetric radar, a system that could detect a submarine's conning tower in complete darkness or heavy fog, stripped the U-boat of its most important tactical advantage, the ability to recharge batteries on the surface at night. Before 1943, a U-boat commander could reasonably expect to surface after dark and run his diesel engines for several hours, recharging for the following day's patrol. After 1943, that window was gone. Allied aircraft equipped with radar and powerful searchlights could locate a surfacing submarine within minutes. The Bay of Biscay, the transit route between German ports and the open Atlantic, became, in the words of one German admiral, a killing ground. The numbers from the Atlantic campaign are staggering. In May 1943 alone, the month that historians have named Black May, the German submarine fleet lost 43 boats. In that single month, the U-boat force suffered losses equivalent to what it had endured across entire years at the beginning of the war. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the U-boat arm, received a message from one of his commanders that read simply, "We are being hunted to extinction." He was not exaggerating. The American experience in the Pacific operated within a different set of horrors. The U.S. Navy entered the war with a fleet of 51 operational submarines and a tactical doctrine built around cautious, carefully managed engagement. What it also entered with, though this would not be publicly acknowledged for nearly 2 years, was a profoundly defective weapon. The Mark 14 torpedo was the primary armament of the American submarine fleet. It had been developed during the interwar years, tested extensively in simulations, and placed in service as the weapon on which the entire Pacific submarine campaign would depend. It did not work. The Mark 14 ran an average of 11 feet deeper than its set depth, deep enough to pass harmlessly beneath the hull of a target ship without detonating. When submarines began reporting failed attacks in the months after Pearl Harbor, the Bureau of Ordnance rejected the complaints as evidence of poor marksmanship. The torpedoes were correct. The commanders were mistaken. This position was maintained at the institutional level for nearly 20 months of active combat. The practical consequence was this: American submariners were sailing into the most dangerous operating environment on Earth, firing their weapons at Japanese targets, watching the torpedoes run straight and true and disappear beneath the hull without detonation, and then enduring the depth charge response of a target that was very much still alive and very much aware of exactly where the attack had come from. Men died in depth charge attacks after what should have been successful strikes. The targets they were supposed to destroy continued moving cargo, fuel, and troops to Japanese island garrisons throughout 1942 and much of 1943. It was not until the summer of 1943 that a set of improvised field tests, commanders dropping Mark 14S from crane height onto a cliff face on the island of Kahulawe, definitively proved what the crews had been reporting for 2 years. The exploder mechanisms were defective. The depth running was wrong. The Bureau of Ordnance had been wrong, and men had died for it. The physical dangers of the submarine were only part of what made the service lethal. There was also the specific psychology of the machine, the particular form of stress that came from living inside a weapon that was designed to be hunted. We have spent most of our history in open air, able to see threat approaching, able to run or fight with our own bodies and our own senses. The submarine removed all of this. A crew under attack could hear the propellers of surface ships directly overhead. a churning, unmistakable sound that grew louder as the vessel approached and passed. They could hear the click of a depth charge being armed. They could count the seconds between the click and the detonation, triangulating, estimating, knowing that the interval was shortening. A man could do nothing except listen and calculate and wait. There was nowhere to go. There was no action to take. There was only the steel hull, the sound of the ocean, and the judgment of the commanding officer. The average age of a German U-boat crewman in 1942 was 21 years old. The psychological toll was documented by German naval physicians who gave it a name: Baden-Stolz-Krankheit, loosely the submarine sickness. Symptoms included chronic insomnia, tremors, emotional instability, and a persistent inability to function in open spaces after prolonged patrols. Men who had completed multiple Atlantic patrols were often described in medical reports as having aged beyond recognition. A 23-year-old veteran of 3 patrols was not uncommon. Neither was the photograph that accompanied his file, which showed someone who looked considerably older. A patrol for an American Pacific submarine averaged around 60 days. A German Atlantic patrol, depending on assignment, ranged from 3 weeks to 3 months. In both cases, the submarine returned to port in one of 2 ways. It arrived, or it did not. There was rarely a middle ground. A damaged submarine that could not surface was a tomb. A submarine whose pressure hull had been breached did not give its crew time to understand what was happening. Below a certain depth, the crush depth, which for most World War II submarines was somewhere between 650 and 800 feet, the pressure differential became unsurvivable in a fraction of a second. The hull imploded. It was instantaneous and complete. Wreckage from submarines lost in deep water was rarely recovered. The men simply ceased to be findable. Of the 52 American submarines lost in the Pacific War, the exact cause of 16 remains unknown. They left port, transmitted routine position reports, and then stopped transmitting. No survivors, no wreckage, no explanation that history has been able to confirm. They are listed in the Navy's records as lost to unknown causes, which is a bureaucratic phrase that captures something true and terrible. The ocean swallowed them entirely, and we never learned what happened. The German situation was, if anything, more nakedly documented. Dönitz maintained meticulous records. He knew, at any given point in the war, how many U-boats were at sea, how many had been confirmed lost, and how many had simply stopped reporting. The running total climbed steadily through 1942, accelerated catastrophically through 1943, and by the final year of the war had consumed the core of an entire generation of German naval officers. Many of the most experienced commanders, men who had accumulated years of patrol experience, who understood the tactical possibilities of the submarine better than anyone alive, were dead before the end of 1943. The men who replaced them were younger, less experienced, and facing an anti-submarine capability that their predecessors had never encountered. The losses in 1944 and 1945 reflected the asymmetry directly. What the submarine accomplished, measured against what it cost, is one of the most ambivalent calculations in the history of warfare. The German U-boat campaign came within measurable proximity to severing Britain's supply lines in 1942. If the tonnage of Allied merchant shipping sunk in that year had continued at the same rate for another 6 months, the mathematics of replacement, ships built versus ships lost, would have turned against Britain in ways that even American industrial capacity might not have corrected in time. The Japanese merchant fleet was effectively destroyed by American submarines. By the final year of the war, submarine warfare had strangled Japanese industry's access to the raw materials of the Pacific, oil from the East Indies, iron ore and bauxite from Southeast Asia, with a completeness that strategic bombing from the air had not achieved and could not have achieved alone. Both of these outcomes shaped the war decisively. Both of them were paid for in the same currency, men sealed into steel cylinders in the cold dark of the ocean, all spending their oxygen and their luck in measures that could not be replenished indefinitely. The trade-off embedded in submarine warfare is one that the history of technology has produced many times, in many forms. We created a weapon of extraordinary strategic power, and then discovered that operating it required placing its crews in a position where survival was not a likely outcome, but a statistical minority. The submarine was simultaneously one of the most effective weapons ever deployed and one of the most dangerous working environments ever engineered. Not through carelessness or bad design, but because the nature of what it had to do was fundamentally incompatible with the survival of the people doing it. To be invisible, it had to be sealed. To be sealed, it had to be airless, pressurized, vulnerable to the same forces it used for concealment. The ocean was not an environment we had learned to inhabit. We had found a way to use it. There is a difference. The submarines themselves are still out there. Most of them will never be found. The men inside them are part of the seafloor now, in water too deep to reach and too cold to disturb. What they accomplished, the convoys stopped, the supply lines cut, the strategic balances shifted, outlasted them entirely. What it cost to accomplish it is visible only in the casualty lists, in the photographs of young men taken before patrols that did not end, in the letters that were